In 1947, the United States Navy sent 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft to Antarctica. The operation was called Highjump. It returned to the United States considerably earlier than planned. 12 years after it ended, the continent it had explored was declared, by international treaty, permanently off-limits to ordinary national activity. Highjump. Hold that word. It is on the surface an ordinary code name. The US Navy in 1947 assigned code names to operations as a matter of routine bureaucratic practice. Most of the names meant nothing. They were chosen from approved lists without particular reference to the operations they designated. The names were placeholders. They were not symbolic. Highjump may have been a placeholder, or Highjump may have been, in some way, that the surviving records do not explicitly articulate, a name that carried meaning. To jump high, to leap, to go up and over, rather than around. The verb in the code name describes a motion that has a particular character, sudden, vertical, energetic, that does not on the face of it describe the operation as the operation was officially characterized. The operation officially was a training exercise. Training exercises do not typically deploy aircraft carriers, submarines beneath polar ice, and nearly 5,000 personnel to the most remote continent on Earth. Training exercises do not typically get truncated. Training exercises do not typically become the subject of 15 years of multinational diplomatic negotiation that culminates in the only treaty in human history to designate an entire continent as off-limits to ordinary national activity. These are not the typical features of a training exercise. These are the features of Highjump. I want to walk you through what we know about the operation, what we do not know, and what the gap between the two has come to mean over the past 78 years. Let me tell you how I came to this story. I spent 5 weeks this spring at the National Archives facility at College Park, Maryland, the large federal records center that houses, among many other things, the operational records of the United States Navy from the mid-20th century. I went there to research something else. I was looking, in connection with a different project, at Navy records from the immediate post-war period, the late 1940s, when the service was transitioning from its World War II configuration to its Cold War configuration. The transition was complex. The Navy was demobilizing some operations and standing up others. The records of that transition are voluminous, fragmentary, and only partially catalogued. In Record Group 313, the operational records of the US Naval Operating Forces, I came across a series of folders labelled Operation Highjump. I had heard of Highjump in the way that a person who has read general American military history has heard of any number of post-war operations. I knew it was something to do with Antarctica. I knew Admiral Byrd was involved. I knew it had taken place in 1946 and 1947. I had not known how large it was. I pulled the first folder and started reading. What I found in the operational records was an expedition of a scale I had not anticipated. The ship list alone runs to 2 pages. The personnel manifest runs to 23. The flight log for the period of active operations runs to 41. The expenditure records, partial and somewhat redacted, indicate a total operational cost that would have been, in 2026 dollars, in the range of $1 to $2 billion. $1 to $2 billion. For a training exercise. I sat with that figure for a while. I went back to the introductory documents. I read the operational order that initiated the project. I read the after-action report that concluded it. I read the correspondence between Admiral Byrd and the Joint Chiefs of Staff that ran throughout. The records described the operation, consistently, as primarily training. The records also described what the operation actually did. And what it actually did was substantially more than ordinary training. I want to walk you through both. You do not need to hold every ship. You do not need to track every flight. The records are 78 years old. They have been in the National Archives at College Park for most of that time, in boxes, in folders, in the standard military records arrangement that the Navy used in the late 1940s. They are not going anywhere tonight. We have time. Sit back. Let the lamp dim if you like. Let me describe the operational order. The order initiating Operation Highjump was signed by the Chief of Naval Operations on August 26, 1946. The order designated Task Force 68 as the operational unit, with Rear Admiral Richard H. Cruzen as Task Force Commander and Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd as officer in charge of the expedition. Byrd was the more famous of the two. He had been to the Antarctic before, leading 3 previous private expeditions in 1928 to 1930, 1933 to 1935, and 1939 to 1941. He was, by 1946, the most experienced Antarctic explorer in US military service. He had been promoted to Rear Admiral in the regular Navy in 1944 after extensive service during World War II in the Pacific Theatre. Byrd was, in some sense, the public face of Highjump. He was the named expedition leader. He was the figure who would, in subsequent years, give interviews and speeches and write occasional articles about polar matters. Cruzen, the task force commander, was the operational figure. He commanded the actual movement of the ships and the conduct of the day-to-day operations. He was a career Navy officer with experience in cold weather operations. He was, in the surviving records, the technical author of the operational reports. The two men, Byrd and Cruzen, do not in the surviving correspondence appear to have always been in close agreement about how the expedition should be conducted. The points of disagreement, where they are visible in the records, generally relate to questions of operational pace, scientific scope, and the priority to be given to specific reconnaissance objectives. I want to be careful not to overstate the disagreements. The two men were professional officers operating within a chain of command. Their disagreements, where they existed, were managed through normal command processes. But the disagreements are visible. They are not edited out of the records as fully as one might expect, given the official narrative of Highjump as a smoothly run training exercise. Let me describe the ship list. Task Force 68 consisted of 13 ships. They were the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea, an Essex-class fleet carrier that had been commissioned in 1946. The Philippine Sea carried the long-range aircraft that would conduct the aerial photography and reconnaissance of the expedition. The seaplane tender USS Pine Island, which serviced the PBM Mariner flying boats that performed the bulk of the actual aerial reconnaissance. The seaplane tender USS Currituck, sister ship to Pine Island, performing similar functions on the Eastern Task Group. The icebreakers USS Burton Island and USS Northwind. These were specialised vessels capable of operating in heavy pack ice. The communications and command ship USS Mount Olympus, which served as the operational flagship for Admiral Cruzen. The destroyer USS Brownson, the high-speed transport USS Henderson, and several auxiliary vessels, including supply ships and tankers. The submarine USS Senate. This is, in some respects, the most unusual element of the task force. Submarines are not generally associated with Antarctic operations. The Senate was a Balao-class fleet submarine, completed during World War II, that had been modified for polar operations. Its presence in Task Force 68 indicates that the expedition's planning included undersea reconnaissance, operations that in 1947 would have been highly classified. The 13 ships together constituted the largest naval expedition ever sent to the Antarctic. They remain to this day the largest single Antarctic deployment in history. I want to give you a moment to sit with that figure. The largest single Antarctic deployment in history was a US Navy training exercise in 1946 to 1947. No subsequent deployment by any nation has approached its scale. The Soviet Union, during its period of intensive Antarctic research in the 1950s and 1960s, maintained a substantial scientific presence on the continent, but never deployed comparable military force. The British, the French, the Norwegians, and the other treaty signatories conducted scientific operations. They did not send aircraft carriers and submarines. The continent, after Highjump, was operationally accessed primarily by scientific research stations under the auspices of national Antarctic programs. The level of military deployment that Highjump represented has not been repeated. It has not been repeated in part because, after 1961, it was illegal under the Antarctic Treaty for it to be repeated. The treaty prohibits, among other things, military operations of any kind on the continent. Article 1, Section 1 of the treaty reads, "Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only. There shall be prohibited, inter alia, any measures of a military nature, such as the establishment of military bases and fortifications, the carrying out of military manoeuvres, as well as the testing of any type of weapons. The treaty does not say that scientific personnel may not be Navy personnel. They may be. The McMurdo Station, the principal US research base, is operated in part by US Navy logistics personnel. The treaty distinguishes between military activity and military personnel. The personnel are permitted for logistical support. The activity is restricted to peaceful purposes. But the kind of deployment that Highjump represented, combat ship, submarines, aircraft carriers, military aircraft engaged in active reconnaissance, is, under the treaty, prohibited. The treaty made permanent what Highjump's truncation had begun. Let me describe the operational pace of Highjump. The task force departed the United States in stages, beginning in late November 1946. The various groups rendezvoused in the Antarctic Operating Area in late December 1946 and early January 1947. The original operational plan called for active operations on and around the Antarctic continent for a period of approximately 6 to 8 months. This would have placed the conclusion of operations in the late southern winter or early spring of 1947, with the task force departing for home in mid to late 1947. The active operations period was, in fact, substantially shorter. The first ships arrived in the operating area on December 30th, 1946. Active flight operations began on January 9th, 1947. The operation was officially terminated with the recall of all units to base areas by February 23rd, 1947, a period of active operations of approximately 7 weeks. The task force departed the Antarctic Operating Area in late February and early March 1947. The various ships had returned to US ports by mid-April 1947. The operation that had been planned for 6 to 8 months of active Antarctic activity was completed on the continent in approximately 7 weeks. I want to be precise about what this means. The active operations phase was not the only Antarctic activity. The ships spent additional time in transit to and from the operating area. They spent time positioning, fueling, conducting initial reconnaissance. They spent time in the recovery phase after operations concluded. The total time of the expedition, including transit and ancillary activities, was approximately 3.5 months, from the first ship's departure from the United States in late November 1946 to the last ship's return in mid-April 1947. The active operations phase on the continent was 7 weeks of that 3.5 months. The original plan, in its more detailed versions in the planning files, had called for active operations on the continent extending across the entire 1946 to 1947 Antarctic summer, with possible continuation into the early southern winter for specific reconnaissance objectives that could be conducted under reduced operational tempo. The plan envisioned, in other words, 3 to 4 months of active continental operations, with the possibility of extension. What actually occurred was 7 weeks of active operations. The reduction from 3 to 4 months down to 7 weeks is, in operational terms, substantial. It reflects either a decision to terminate operations early or a determination that the original timeline was no longer feasible. The records, as I've noted, address but do not fully explain this reduction. The reasons for this truncation, in the surviving operational records, are addressed but not, in my view, fully explained. I want to walk you through the explanations that are offered. The first explanation is weather. The 1946 to 1947 Antarctic summer season was, by historical standards, an unusually difficult one. Pack ice extended farther north than typical. Storm activity was more frequent. Visibility was, in many of the operational areas, persistently poor. This explanation is partially supported by the meteorological records. The weather conditions were difficult. The operations were hampered by them, but the weather conditions were not, by Antarctic standards, catastrophic. Other expeditions before and after Highjump have operated in comparable or worse conditions. The weather was a real factor. The weather is not, in my reading of the records, sufficient to explain the truncation by itself. The second explanation is operational losses. 3 aircraft were lost during Highjump operations. Most significantly, on December 30, 1,946, actually before the official commencement of operations, a PBM Mariner designated George I crashed on Thurston Island, killing 3 of the 9 men aboard. The survivors were rescued 13 days later. The crash was attributed, in the official report, to weather-induced navigation error. 2 other aircraft were lost in subsequent incidents, with no fatalities in those cases. The aircraft losses were significant. They were not, by the standards of large military operations, catastrophic. 3 aircraft and 3 lives is a serious loss for a peacetime training exercise. But it is not, on its own, sufficient to truncate an operation that had been planned for 6 to 8 months, and that had committed nearly 5,000 personnel. The third explanation is logistical. The supply lines from the United States to the Antarctic operating area were long, complex, and weather-dependent. Resupply was difficult. The operational tempo sustained over months would have strained the logistics system. This explanation has merit. Sustaining a large operation in a remote location is genuinely difficult. The logistics were a real consideration. But the logistical concerns were known in advance, in the planning phase. The operation had been authorised for 6 to 8 months precisely because the planners had assessed that the logistics could be sustained. If the logistics had been judged inadequate, the operation would not have been authorised at the planned scale and duration. The truncation, in other words, represents a departure from what the planners had assessed as feasible. Something changed in the course of operations that made the original plan no longer appropriate. I want to be honest about what the records say and what they do not. The records do not explicitly state that the operation was truncated because of any specific discovery, encounter, or event on the continent. The records in their final after-action report describe the operation as having achieved its objectives within the reduced time frame and as having returned home ahead of schedule due to a combination of weather, operational success, and reduced need for extended deployment. That is what the official record says. That is the explanation that has been accepted for 78 years in the standard historiography of the operation. The standard historiography is technically defensible. It is supported by the official documents. It does not, however, fully account for several features of the operation that the official documents themselves preserve. Those features are the unprecedented scale of the deployment, the largest Antarctic operation ever conducted before or since, the unusual composition of the task force, aircraft carrier, submarine, icebreakers, the full apparatus of a wartime expeditionary force, the truncated duration, 7 weeks of active operations instead of 6 to 8 months, the unusual aftermath. 12 years later, a comprehensive international treaty restricted military activity on the continent for the foreseeable future. These features, taken together, sit uncomfortably with the explanation that Highjump was simply a training exercise. The features can be explained, in each individual case, by ordinary factors. The combination of all the features, in a single operation, is unusual enough to invite further questions. I want to give you a breath here. I have been walking you through the surface of the Highjump archive. The surface is what the official records describe. The ships, the personnel, the flights, the costs, the official explanations. The surface is what we know, in the conventional sense. What I want to walk through next is what the surface does not tell us. The gaps, the redactions, the records that have been removed, the records that may have been classified, the records that may exist but that have not been declassified. Before I do that, I want to acknowledge something. I came to this story expecting to debunk the conspiratorial readings of Highjump. The conspiratorial readings, there are several, and they vary widely in plausibility and evidentiary support, typically claim that Highjump encountered something extraordinary on the Antarctic continent. The most common variants involve either A, a surviving Nazi base in Antarctica, established during World War II and discovered by Highjump, B, a non-human entity or technology of some kind, encountered during operations, or C, anomalous geographic or geological features that were withheld from public disclosure. The first variant, the Nazi base, has some basis in real history. The Germans did in fact mount an expedition to Antarctica in 1938 to 1939, designating an area as New Swabia. The expedition was real. Its scope was limited. It did not establish a substantial military presence, and the area was not occupied during World War II beyond what the 1938 to 1939 expedition had done. The Nazi base in Antarctica reading, as it has developed in the post-war period, has substantially exceeded what the actual German activity supports. The second variant, non-human encounter, has no evidentiary basis I have been able to identify. The third variant, anomalous geographic or geological features, has in my view the most interesting case to make. It is not the same as the first two variants. It does not require non-human entities or surviving Nazi installations. It asks instead whether the conventional understanding of Antarctic geography and geology, as it stood in 1947, was complete. The case for the third variant rests on several observations. The high-jump aerial photography produced an enormous amount of imagery. By some accounts, more than 70,000 photographs of the Antarctic coastline. Much of this imagery was used to produce the first comprehensive aerial maps of large portions of the continent. Some of the imagery, however, has either not been fully released or has been released only after substantial delay. I have not, in my research, been able to access the full high-jump photographic archive. The publicly available portion is extensive, but, by the standards of what the expedition is known to have produced, incomplete. Let me describe what is publicly available. The Naval History and Heritage Command holds approximately 12,000 photographs attributed to Operation Highjump. These photographs are catalogued, accessible to researchers, and have been used in numerous published works on Antarctic exploration. The US Geological Survey holds an additional collection of photographs that were used in the post-expedition mapping work. These photographs were declassified through standard archival processes between the 1950s and the 1980s. They are also publicly accessible. The Byrd Polar and Climate Research Center at Ohio State University holds the personal papers of Richard E. Byrd, including some of his diary entries from the high jump period and some unofficial photographs from the expedition. The Byrd Papers are accessible to researchers under standard archival protocols. These three collections, Naval History, USGS and Byrd, together constitute the publicly available high jump archive. The publicly available archive is large. The expedition is known to have produced photographic material exceeding what is in these collections. The discrepancy between what the expedition is known to have produced and what is publicly available is documented in some of the original operational records. The flight logs reference photographic missions whose specific products are not in the publicly accessible archives. The mission reports reference photographic surveys of areas whose photographs are not, in any catalogue I have been able to find, identified. I cannot tell you with certainty what is in the gap. I can tell you the gap exists. The expedition produced more photographic material than is publicly accessible. Hold this. I want to walk through the question of why the gap might exist. The most innocent explanation is administrative. Large military expeditions produce enormous amounts of material. Not all of it is preserved, catalogued, or accessioned to the public archives. Some is lost. Some is destroyed in the course of routine records management. Some is retained in military storage facilities that are not subject to public catalogue access. This explanation is, by historical standards, plausible. Military records management in the 1940s and 1950s was inconsistent. The transition from wartime to peacetime documentation practices was difficult. Records were lost, destroyed, and mislaid in ways that we now find regrettable, but that were, at the time, ordinary. A second explanation is classification. Some of the high jump material may have been classified at the time of the operation, and may remain classified today. Classification in the US system can be applied to records for periods that extend, in some cases for decades or longer. National security classification can also be retroactively applied to records that were not originally classified. If a portion of the high jump material is classified, the classification would not be visible from the public catalogue. The public catalogue would show only what has been declassified. The classified material would be in the operational holdings of the Navy or other agencies, accessible only through the formal declassification request process. A third explanation is something more like deliberate suppression. In this explanation, certain high jump materials were not just classified through ordinary administrative processes, but were actively withheld on the basis of decisions made by senior officials, because the materials contained information that the officials judged should not be disclosed. I cannot, from the public archive, distinguish among these three explanations. What I can say is that the gap exists. The reason for the gap is, from outside the classified system, opaque. I want to walk through the question of what the Antarctic Treaty does. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in Washington, D.C. on December 1st, 1959, by 12 nations: Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, the Soviet Union, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It entered into force on June 23, 1961, after ratification by the signatories. The treaty is, by international law standards, an unusual document. It designates an entire continent for peaceful purposes only. It prohibits military activity, nuclear testing, and weapons testing. It sets aside territorial claims to the continent. The claimant nations did not give up their claims, but they agreed that the claims would not be acted on during the term of the treaty. It establishes a regime of mutual scientific cooperation, with each party having the right to inspect the activities of others on the continent. The treaty has been remarkably stable. It has been continuously in force since 1961. It has been extended and supplemented by additional agreements. The Madrid Protocol of 1991, the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources of 1980, and others. The number of signatories has grown from the original 12 to more than 50. Antarctica is, today, governed by this framework. The governance is, by most accounts, successful. There are no military operations on the continent. There is no resource extraction. There is no significant national territorial assertion. The scientific cooperation, while imperfect, is real and ongoing. The framework is also unique. No other continent is governed in this way. No other region of comparable size has been declared, by international treaty, off limits to ordinary national activity. I want to be honest about what the treaty was designed to do. The treaty was negotiated, in significant part, to manage Cold War tensions. The Soviet Union and the United States both had interests in the Antarctic. Neither wanted the continent to become a venue for direct military competition. The treaty provided a framework for coexistence that did not require either side to give up its scientific or strategic interests. The treaty was also designed to manage territorial disputes. 7 of the original signatories, Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the United Kingdom, had pre-existing territorial claims on portions of Antarctica. The claims overlapped in some cases, notably the British, Argentine, and Chilean claims in the Antarctic Peninsula region. The treaty allowed the claimants to suspend the practical exercise of their claims while preserving their legal status. These purposes are real. The treaty was, in significant part, a Cold War diplomatic instrument designed to manage specific tensions. What the treaty also did, however, was to declare an entire continent off limits to the kind of activity, military deployment, resource extraction, territorial annexation, that has in human history characterized national interaction with newly accessible territories. This declaration is, in historical perspective, unusual. When new territories have become accessible to European powers, the Americas, Africa, the Pacific, the historical pattern has been competition, annexation, and exploitation. The treaty represents a break from this pattern. The break is justified in the treaty documents in terms of the unique character of Antarctica and the need for peaceful scientific cooperation. The justifications are real. They are also, in my reading, somewhat thin relative to the scope of what the treaty actually does. The treaty restricts national activity on the continent to a degree that goes well beyond what would be required for ordinary scientific cooperation. The justification for that degree of restriction is not in the treaty documents or in the negotiating history I have been able to review, fully articulated. I want to walk you through the negotiating history briefly. The treaty was negotiated over a period of approximately 6 years, from 1953 to 1959. The negotiations were complex, involving multiple rounds of discussion among the 12 signatory states. The negotiating positions of the various parties evolved substantially over the course of the discussions. The U.S. State Department papers from this period are partially available at the National Archives. The Lyman-Lemnitzer papers at the Library of Congress contain Joint Chiefs of Staff materials from the negotiating period. The British, Australian, and other foreign archives have their own collections. I have spent time, in connection with this project, with the US materials. I have not been able to access the foreign archives at the same level. What I can say, from the US materials, is that the US negotiating position evolved in interesting ways. The initial US position in the early 1950s was relatively assertive about US interests in the Antarctic. By the late 1950s, the US position had moved toward a more cooperative, restriction-oriented framework. The shift in position is documented in the State Department papers. The reasons for the shift are addressed but not, in my view, fully explained. One of the explanations offered in the State Department materials is that the US judged that the costs of competitive activity on the continent were not justified by the benefits. The Antarctic was, on this reading, simply not strategically valuable enough to compete over. This explanation is plausible. The Antarctic is, by most strategic measures, of limited direct value. Its main interest is scientific, with secondary interest in fisheries and potential mineral resources. But the same logic could have been applied to other remote regions, the Arctic, the deep ocean, parts of the African and South American interior, where competitive activity nonetheless took place during the same period. The decision to make Antarctica subject to a comprehensive, restrictive treaty, while other regions were not, suggests that something about Antarctica specifically motivated the framework. What that something was, the negotiating record does not clearly say. I want to give you a moment to think about that. A multinational treaty declaring an entire continent off limits to ordinary state activity, signed 12 years after a US Navy operation of unprecedented scale that returned home substantially early. Negotiated during a period in which the US State Department's position shifted from competitive to cooperative, without clear documentary explanation. These are observations about the pattern of activity. They are not, by themselves, conclusive about the existence of any specific hidden discovery during Highjump. They are observations that, taken together, sit uncomfortably with the explanation that the treaty was simply the natural product of post-war scientific cooperation. The treaty did much more than enable scientific cooperation. The treaty closed the continent. I want to walk you through some of the specific provisions of the treaty, because I think the specificity matters. Article 1 prohibits military activity, including weapons testing. Article 2 protects freedom of scientific investigation. Article 3 provides for the exchange of scientific information. Article 4 addresses territorial claims, suspending their practical exercise while preserving their legal status. Article 5 prohibits nuclear explosions and the disposal of radioactive waste material in Antarctica. Article 6 defines the area to which the treaty applies, south of 60 degrees south latitude, including all ice shelves. Article 7 establishes inspection rights. Each signatory party has the right to designate observers who may, at any time, inspect any station, installation, equipment, vessel, or aircraft of any other party operating in the treaty area. Article 7 is, to my reading, one of the most distinctive features of the treaty. The right of mutual inspection, unannounced, comprehensive, and exercisable by any signatory against any other, is unusual in international law. It is the kind of provision typically found in arms control treaties, where the concern is to prevent prohibited activity. It is not typically found in scientific cooperation agreements, where the concern is to facilitate joint work. The inclusion of Article 7 in the Antarctic Treaty suggests that the parties, in 1959, were concerned about the possibility of prohibited activity being conducted on the continent in violation of the treaty's prohibitions. The concern was, evidently, sufficient to motivate a comprehensive inspection regime. Why the parties were so concerned, the negotiating record does not fully explain. The general concern about military activity in the Cold War context is, in part, an answer. But the specific application of an aggressive inspection regime to Antarctica, when no comparable regime was applied to other regions of similar military interest, suggests a more specific concern. I want to give you a breath. This is a heavy archive, the kind that makes you want to sleep on it in the literal sense. Let your eyes close. Let the lamp dim. Let the record settle in like a slow rain. That is fine. That is exactly the pace this material wants. The boxes are at College Park. The folders are tied with cotton tape. The pencil and typescript on the page are still readable by anyone who chooses to drive an hour out from Washington and sit in the reading room. You do not need to track every article of the treaty. You do not need to memorize every ship in Task Force 68. The history is what the history is. The patterns are what they are. We can walk through them slowly. I want to walk through the question of what Highjump actually found. The official after-action report describes the geographic and geological findings of the expedition. The findings include photographic mapping of approximately 1.5 million square miles of Antarctic coastline and adjacent areas, with particular emphasis on the Ross Sea region, the Bellingshausen Sea, and Marie Byrd Land. Discovery and naming of several new geographic features, including mountains, glaciers, and ice shelves. The US Geological Survey absorbed these findings into subsequent Antarctic maps, survey of the magnetic conditions in the South Polar region, including refined estimates of the location of the South Magnetic Pole, logistical experience in cold weather operations, including aircraft handling, ship operations in pack ice, and personnel performance in extreme conditions. These are the documented findings. They are real. They contributed to subsequent Antarctic research. The documented findings do not include anything that would, on their face, justify the unusual scale of the operation, its early termination, or the subsequent multinational restriction of access to the continent. The documented findings are, by the standards of major Antarctic expeditions, ordinary. The mapping was extensive, but not unprecedented. The geographic discoveries were significant, but not transformative. The logistical experience was valuable, but not sufficient to justify the cost of the operation by itself. If Highjump did something more than the documented findings indicate, the something more is not in the public after-action report. Let me describe what Byrd personally said about the operation. Richard E. Byrd gave numerous interviews and public statements about Highjump in the years following the operation. He also wrote articles and gave speeches about polar exploration more broadly. His public statements about Highjump specifically are, in the surviving record, somewhat guarded. In a March 1947 press conference, after his return to the United States, Byrd described the operation as highly successful and emphasized its training value. He noted the geographic mapping accomplishments. He referenced the difficult weather conditions. He did not, in any of his publicly preserved statements that I have been able to find, describe specific incidents on the continent that would explain the operation's truncation. Byrd also gave a series of interviews to the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio in March 1947, while in transit from the Antarctic. In one of these interviews, Byrd is reported to have made statements about the need for the United States to take defensive measures against polar countries, and about the possibility of an enemy attacking the United States from the polar regions in a future war. The Chilean interview is preserved in part in El Mercurio's archives and in subsequent journalistic accounts. The full text of the interview, in its original Spanish, is available. The statements attributed to Byrd in the interview are, on their face, surprising. They describe the polar regions as having strategic significance that the official Highjump report does not emphasize. The Chilean interview has been cited extensively in the conspiratorial literature about Highjump, often in versions that exaggerate or distort what Byrd actually said. I want to be careful here. The interview is real. The basic statements about polar strategic significance are in the preserved text. The more elaborate claims that have been attributed to Byrd by later writers, about non-human aircraft, about Nazi survivors, about flying objects emerging from polar ice, are not supported by the preserved text of the interview. What the interview supports is a more limited observation. Byrd, in March 1947, while still in transit from Antarctica, made statements suggesting that the polar regions had strategic significance, that the operation he had just completed had not been described in those terms in public. That observation is interesting. It is also limited. I want to walk you through what Byrd's diaries say. The Byrd diaries preserved at the Byrd Polar and Climate Research Center at Ohio State University contain entries from the period of Highjump. The entries are not as extensive as one might wish. Byrd was a busy expedition leader, and his diary writing was sometimes brief. Some entries appear to have been removed or were never made. The diary record for certain key dates is partial. What is in the diaries is, in the main, administrative and logistical. Notes about meetings, weather observations, personnel matters, supply concerns. The diaries do not, in any passage I have been able to read, contain explicit narrative of specific discoveries or encounters that would explain the operation's truncation. The diaries also do not, in any passage I have been able to read, contain explicit denials of such discoveries or encounters. The diaries are, in their tone, oddly neutral. They are the work of a man recording the practical details of his work, without much expansion into the broader significance of what he was doing. The neutrality may reflect Byrd's personal style. It may also reflect awareness on Byrd's part that the diaries would eventually be read by others. Byrd had been a public figure for decades. By 1946, he had been writing for publication since his first expedition in 1928. He was by temperament careful about what he committed to paper. His private writings, where they have been preserved, tend toward the same careful tone as his public statements. Whether this is character, or training, or strategic awareness, I cannot say from outside. What I can say is that if Byrd had encountered something extraordinary on Highjump that he chose not to record fully in his diary, his pattern of writing would have produced exactly the kind of partial record that survives. The record is consistent with him having had reason to be careful. It is also consistent with him simply being a careful diarist, whose work happened to lack the kind of dramatic content that would have produced more vivid passages. Both interpretations are available from the surviving text. There are gaps in the diary record where I would expect entries to exist. The gaps are not necessarily significant. Diaries always have gaps, but they are notable. Certain dates that were operationally significant have no diary entry. Certain meetings that are referenced in other Byrd correspondence are not described in the diary. I cannot conclude from the gaps that the diaries have been edited. I can note that the diary record for the Highjump period is more partial than I had expected. I want to give you a breath, I have been walking you through Byrd's public statements, the Chilean interview, the diaries. The picture that emerges is of a man who, in 1947, was reticent in ways that suggest he had information he was not sharing. This may be overreading. Many public figures in the late 1940s were reticent about classified material. The Cold War was emerging. Operational security was a real concern. Byrd's reticence may reflect ordinary security awareness, rather than any specific suppression of remarkable information. What I can say, from the public record alone, is that Byrd's pattern of communication is consistent with him having had information that he chose not to share publicly. Whether that information was extraordinary or merely classified through ordinary security procedures, I cannot tell from outside the security system. Hold this. I want to walk you through the question of submarines. The USS Senate was a Balao-class fleet submarine that had been commissioned in 1944. It had served in the Pacific during World War II, conducting war patrols against Japanese shipping. By 1946, it had been modified for cold water operations and was assigned to Task Force 68. The presence of a submarine on an Antarctic training expedition was, even at the time, somewhat unusual. Submarines are not typical components of polar reconnaissance forces. The cost of deploying a submarine to the Antarctic, including the logistical support required, is substantial. The Senate's role in Highjump is described in the surviving operational records in general terms. The submarine conducted undersea operations in the pack ice region. It tested equipment. It contributed to mapping efforts. The specific missions of the Senate during Highjump are partially documented and partially not. I want to walk through the submarine question in a bit more depth. The Senate was approximately 311 feet long. It displaced 1,500 tons surfaced, 2,400 tons submerged. It had a crew of approximately 75 officers and enlisted men. It was equipped with the standard armament of a Balao-class fleet submarine, modified for cold water operations with insulation, equipment heating, and ice-strengthened hatches. For Highjump, the Senate operated primarily from positions in the Ross Sea and adjacent open water. The submarine did not, as far as the surviving records indicate, conduct extended under-ice operations in the way that nuclear submarines would later perform in Arctic conditions. The Balao-class boats were diesel-electric. They were not designed for prolonged submerged operation, and the under-ice environment was beyond their operational envelope for extended missions. What the Senate did in the available records was demonstrate the feasibility of submarine operations in Antarctic conditions. The boat operated in pack ice. It tested communications equipment. It conducted brief submerged operations beneath ice edges. It returned to surface for the bulk of its time on station. The detailed operational records of the Senate's Highjump activities are, by my reading of the public archive, less extensive than the operational records of the surface vessels. This may reflect ordinary classification practices. Submarine operations were, in the late 1940s, generally classified at higher levels than surface operations. The specific missions of the Senate may still be classified, or may have been declassified into archives that are not the standard public catalogues. What I can say is that the submarine was there. The submarine was deployed for purposes that were not, in the publicly available records, fully described. The submarine returned to the United States with the rest of the task force. The presence of the Senate is, in my view, one of the most interesting features of Highjump. It suggests that the operation included undersea reconnaissance objectives that the public record does not fully describe. I want to walk you through one more piece of the archive. In Record Group 313, Box 47, Folder 12, of the Operation Highjump records at the National Archives, there is a document titled Operational Recommendations, Post-Highjump. The document is undated. It appears to have been written between February and April 1947, based on internal references to dates and personnel. The document is unsigned. It is on standard Navy memorandum letterhead. The document is 3.5 pages long. It addresses the question of follow-up operations to Highjump. The document does not recommend follow-up operations. This is, in itself, slightly unusual. Most large military operations produce follow-up recommendations. The Highjump after-action documents include various recommendations for future polar work, but they tend towards smaller-scale scientific operations rather than continuations of the Highjump scale deployment. What the document does recommend, however, is a particular kind of restraint. The document recommends, in language that is bureaucratically careful but unambiguous, that the United States should consider whether continued large-scale military activity in the Antarctic is consistent with broader strategic interests, and that the United States should consider whether multilateral diplomatic arrangements might better serve those interests than unilateral operations. The document, in other words, recommends pivoting from military activity in the Antarctic to diplomatic engagement. This recommendation, made in early 1947, is approximately 12 years ahead of the actual signing of the Antarctic Treaty. The reasoning in the document, while it does not specifically describe Highjump findings as the basis for the recommendation, suggests that something in the Highjump experience motivated a shift in US policy toward Antarctica. The shift, as I have already described, did eventually occur in the 1950s. The 1947 document anticipates the shift by more than a decade. I have looked in subsequent files for documentation that would describe what specifically motivated the 1947 recommendation. The documentation, in the publicly available archive, is not there. The recommendation appears in the document as a relatively final position, rather than as a discussion of options. The reasoning that supports the position is referenced obliquely, not laid out. I want to give you a breath here. We have walked through a lot. Highjump's scale, its composition, its truncation, its photographic gaps, the Byrd communications, the Senate, the 1947 operational recommendation, the Antarctic Treaty's eventual provisions. You do not need to hold all of this. The records are at College Park. The Byrd Papers are at Ohio State. The treaty text is, of course, public. The pieces of the story are accessible to anyone who knows to look for them. What I want to walk through next is the question of why these pieces have not been more thoroughly engaged with by mainstream historical research, what the alternative readings have made of them, and what I think the responsible interpretive position is. Let me describe one specific document. In Record Group 313, Box 52, Folder 7, of the Operation Highjump records, there is a typewritten memorandum dated February 12, 1947. The memorandum is from Admiral Cruzen, the task force commander, to the Chief of Naval Operations. The subject line reads, Operational Status Report. The memorandum is brief and means about a page and a half. It reports the operational status of Task Force 68 as of that date. It describes the current weather conditions in the operating area. It reports on equipment status and personnel condition. It notes the progress of photographic reconnaissance missions. The final paragraph of the memorandum reads, in part, recommend consideration of accelerated withdrawal timeline. Operational conditions have not improved as projected. Further sustained operations in current area are not, in my assessment, justified by the marginal, additional reconnaissance value relative to operational risk. That paragraph is, in its careful Navy memorandum style, a recommendation for early termination of the operation. The Chief of Naval Operations endorsed the recommendation. The recall order was issued on February 15, 1947. Active operations terminated by February 23, 1947. The 1947 memorandum, in its specific phrasing, does not describe what made the conditions not as projected. It does not describe what operational risk was elevated. It describes only the practical conclusion that further operations were not justified and that withdrawal was recommended. The reasoning that supports the conclusion is not in the memorandum. The reasoning may be elsewhere. The reasoning may be in classified attachments that the publicly accessible memorandum does not include. The reasoning may be in conversations and meetings that were not recorded in writing. The reasoning may also have been understood, at the time, by those involved, in ways that did not need to be written down in this particular document. Cruisen's superiors at the Chief of Naval Operations level knew presumably what Cruisen was talking about. The memorandum was not the only communication channel between the task force and the Navy headquarters. There were radio messages, classified cables, and personal briefings that would have communicated information that does not appear in the written record. What I have access to from outside the security system is the public memorandum. The memorandum recommends withdrawal without specifying why withdrawal is justified. I want to spend a moment with the phrase operational risk. Operational risk in military parlance has specific meanings. It can refer to risk of casualties from enemy action, from accidents, from environmental conditions, from equipment failure. It can refer to risk of mission failure relative to mission accomplishment. It can refer to risk of disclosure of classified information. In the context of Highjump, the obvious candidates for operational risk are weather and environmental conditions. The Antarctic operating environment is genuinely dangerous. Aircraft have been lost. Personnel have been at risk of frostbite, hypothermia, and worse. These risks were real and continuous throughout the operation. But the operation had been planned with these risks in mind. The risks were known. The expedition had been authorized to operate under these conditions for 6 to 8 months. If the risks had been the operational determinant, the operation would have been authorized for a shorter duration in the first place. The reference to elevated operational risk in February 1947 suggests that something had changed since the planning phase, that a risk had emerged, or had been recognized, that the planners had not anticipated. What that risk was, the memorandum does not say. The candidate explanations include unusual weather conditions exceeding what had been anticipated, equipment failures that compounded the operational difficulty, intelligence concerns that emerged during operations, encounter with conditions or features that the planners had not anticipated. Each of these is possible. The records do not, in the publicly accessible form, allow a clean determination among them. I want to walk through one more specific document. In Record Group 313, Box 49, Folder 3, there is a typed transcript of a radio message from Admiral Byrd to the Chief of Naval Operations, dated February 14, 1947. The message is brief, 3 sentences. The message reads, "Concur with COMT ASKFOR 68 recommendation. Conditions encountered require reassessment of expedition objectives. Recommend full debriefing upon return." That is the entire message. The phrase conditions encountered is consistent with various readings. It could refer to weather, it could refer to ice conditions, it could refer to operational difficulties of a logistical nature, it could refer to something else entirely. What the message does is endorse Cruisen's recommendation for early termination, characterize the situation as requiring reassessment, and request full debriefing upon return. Full debriefing upon return is, in Navy terminology, a request for in-person reporting that would not be conducted by radio or written cable. The phrase suggests that there was information Byrd considered too sensitive for the radio channel, or that he considered required in-person discussion to convey adequately. Whether the debriefing actually occurred and what was discussed in it, the publicly accessible record does not say. There is no transcript of any such debriefing in the publicly available files. There may be one in classified holdings, there may be no formal transcript at all, with the debriefing having occurred in conversation that was not recorded. The request for full debriefing is the last public reference to this matter in the operational records I have been able to access. I want to give you a breath here. We have walked through Cruisen's February 12th memorandum, Byrd's February 14th radio response, the recall order of February 15th, the termination of active operations on February 23rd. The sequence is consistent with a decision made over a period of about 10 days to terminate the operation early on the basis of conditions that the records refer to, but do not specify. The sequence is also consistent with the kind of careful documentation that would be produced if the decision makers wanted to leave a clear paper trail of the operational decision without committing the underlying intelligence to the same paper trail. I do not know which interpretation is correct. What I can say is that the sequence is documented. The withdrawal occurred. The reasons for the withdrawal were communicated through channels that the public record does not fully preserve. The mainstream historiography of Highjump, as it exists in the standard works on US Antarctic policy, treats the operation as a relatively ordinary post-war training exercise that contributed to subsequent scientific work, and that was eventually superseded by the cooperative framework of the treaty. This historiography is, technically, defensible. The operation was officially described as training. The treaty did supersede unilateral military activity. The historiography does not, however, engage substantially with the specific features I have been describing. The scale relative to the declared purpose, the truncation, the photographic gaps, the Senate's classified missions, the early 1947 policy recommendation that anticipates the treaty by 12 years. These features sit in the archive. They have been documented by individual researchers in publications outside the academic mainstream. They have not been integrated into a sustained academic treatment of Highjump. The reasons for this absence of academic engagement are, I believe, several. First, the alternative readings of Highjump, the Nazi base, the non-human encounter, the suppressed photographic evidence, have, in their more extreme forms, become so associated with conspiracy literature that academic engagement risks association with that literature. Academic historians have generally preferred to avoid the topic rather than to engage with it in a way that might be misread as endorsing the more extreme alternative readings. Second, the relevant archives are spread across multiple institutions, multiple agencies, and multiple security classifications. Working through the full Highjump archive requires more sustained access than most academic projects can fund. Third, the broader topic of Antarctic policy, in its academic treatment, has tended to focus on the treaty and its subsequent evolution, rather than on the pre-treaty operations. The treaty is the institutional success story. The pre-treaty operations are, in this framing, the pre-history. The combined effect of these factors is that Highjump has not received the kind of sustained academic engagement that its scale and significance would, on the face of it, warrant. I want to address the alternative readings directly. The Nazi base reading proposes that Germany, during World War II, established a substantial military base in Antarctica, typically described as being in the Queen Maud Land region, where the 1938 to 1939 expedition had operated. The base on this reading survived the war and was discovered by Highjump. This reading has limited evidentiary support. The 1938 to 1939 German expedition was real, but it was relatively small in scale and did not establish a substantial occupation. The German records of the expedition are partial, but they do not describe the kind of permanent base that the post-war conspiratorial literature has proposed. The Allied investigations of German wartime activities, which were extensive in the late 1940s, did not produce evidence of a substantial Antarctic base. The Nazi base reading is, in my view, not well supported by the available evidence. The German Antarctic activity during World War II was limited. The post-war Allied investigations did not find evidence of a substantial surviving installation. The non-human encounter reading proposes that Highjump encountered, on or near the Antarctic continent, an entity or technology of non-human origin. The reading typically references the Chilean interview with Byrd in distorted forms and various second-hand accounts that emerged in the 1960s and later. This reading has no evidentiary support I have been able to identify. The Chilean interview, in its preserved text, does not describe non-human encounters. The second-hand accounts cannot be traced to authenticated sources. The hypothesis of a non-human encounter is, in my view, an interpretive overreach that exceeds what any preserved documentation supports. The suppressed evidence reading proposes that Highjump found something, geographic, geological or otherwise, that the US government determined should not be publicly disclosed. This reading has more substantial support than the other two. The operational gaps I have described, the photographic archive, the Senate's missions, the 1947 policy recommendation, are consistent with the suppression of information. They are also, however, consistent with ordinary classification practices that have not specifically suppressed dramatic findings. I cannot, from outside the security system, distinguish between ordinary classification and deliberate suppression of dramatic content. The available evidence is consistent with both possibilities. I want to walk through what happened in the year immediately after Highjump. The Navy did conduct a follow-up Antarctic operation in 1947 to 1948. Operation Windmill. Windmill was substantially smaller than Highjump. It involved 2 icebreakers, no aircraft carrier, no submarine, and approximately 500 personnel. Its declared purpose was photographic ground truthing of the Highjump aerial photographs and additional mapping of selected coastal regions. Windmill was, in its scale and configuration, the kind of operation that the standard Antarctic exploration historiography would predict. It used the experience gained from Highjump to conduct a more focused, more efficient scientific operation. It produced specific results: confirmed coordinates for previously photographed features, additional photographic coverage of areas not adequately covered by Highjump, refined mapping. Windmill is, in many ways, what Highjump would have looked like if Highjump had been planned at the scale that its declared purpose required. The fact that Windmill was conducted at the scale appropriate to scientific objectives suggests that the US Navy's actual scientific Antarctic objectives could be met by an operation of Windmill scale. The scale of Highjump, 6 to 10 times larger than Windmill in personnel, ships and aircraft, is hard to justify if the actual objectives were scientific. The Highjump to Windmill comparison is, in my view, one of the strongest pieces of evidence that Highjump's declared purpose did not fully account for its actual scale. If Highjump had been only what it was officially described as, a training exercise, then Windmill would have been redundant. The training value of Highjump would have been preserved without needing additional Antarctic deployment. The fact that follow-up scientific work was conducted at a scale much smaller than Highjump suggests that the scientific objectives were a secondary purpose of Highjump, rather than its primary justification. The primary purpose, whatever it was, is not in the publicly accessible Windmill operational records either. Windmill is, in its public documentation, a scientific operation. It does not, in the records I've reviewed, reference whatever motivated Highjump's primary objectives. I want to give you a breath here. We have walked through Highjump, the Windmill follow-up, the gradual emergence of the IGY Treaty framework. The pattern is a large unusual operation in 1946 to 1947, followed by smaller scientific operations, followed by the gradual development of a multinational restrictive framework, culminating in the 1959 treaty. The pattern is documented. The pattern is unusual. The pattern, in its specifics, has not been fully accounted for by the standard historiography. I want to take you to one more part of the archive. In 1957, the International Geophysical Year began. The IGY was a coordinated multinational scientific research program that ran from July 1957 to December 1958. It involved more than 60 nations and covered topics ranging from atmospheric physics to oceanography to seismology. A substantial portion of the IGY was conducted in Antarctica. 12 nations established research stations on the continent. The cooperative framework that emerged from the IGY was the immediate precursor to the Antarctic Treaty. The IGY in Antarctica was, by all available accounts, primarily scientific. The stations conducted seismic surveys, meteorological observations, magnetic measurements, glaciological studies. The data was shared internationally through standard scientific channels. The IGY also, however, served a diplomatic function. The cooperation among the 12 participating nations in Antarctica during the IGY established the working relationships and procedural arrangements that the treaty subsequently formalized. In a sense, the IGY was the practical demonstration that international cooperation on the continent was feasible. The treaty was the legal codification of what the IGY had demonstrated. The shift from Highjump-style unilateral military activity to IGY-style cooperative scientific activity in the decade between 1947 and 1957 was substantial. The shift cannot be fully explained by the 1947 policy recommendation alone. It also required diplomatic groundwork, technical cooperation, and the development of shared scientific infrastructure. The shift was, by 1959, complete. The treaty was signed. The continent was, in practical effect, off-limits to the kind of activity Highjump had represented. I want to give you a breath. We have walked through the operational scale of Highjump, its truncation, its photographic and submarine gaps, the Byrd communications, the 1947 policy recommendation, the IGY, the Antarctic Treaty. The pattern is clear. The operation was unprecedentedly large. It was unprecedentedly short. It was followed by a policy shift that, 12 years later, formalised an unprecedented international restriction on activity in the affected region. The pattern is also incomplete. The specific cause of the truncation, the specific motivation for the policy shift, the specific content of the classified materials, these are not, from outside the security system, visible. The standard historiography fills the gap with ordinary explanations: weather, logistics, Cold War diplomacy. The standard historiography is not wrong about any of these factors. The standard historiography may also be incomplete. I want to walk through the question of subsequent military activity in Antarctica. After the treaty entered into force in 1961, military activity on the continent ceased to be authorised. Military personnel continued to provide logistical support for scientific research stations. But military operations as such, combat ships, military reconnaissance aircraft, military exercises, were prohibited. The prohibition has, by all available accounts, been observed. The signatory parties have not, in the 60-plus years of the treaty, conducted prohibited military activity on the continent. Compliance has been monitored through the mutual inspection provisions of Article 7, with periodic inspection visits conducted by various signatories. What this means in practical terms is that the high-jump scale exploration of the continent has not been repeated. The detailed photographic mapping, the submarine reconnaissance, the large-scale logistical operations, these have not occurred since 1947. Subsequent Antarctic mapping has been conducted, but at a different scale and under different auspices. The US Geological Survey has conducted continuing mapping operations in cooperation with other treaty parties. The Soviet Union and later Russia has conducted its own mapping. The British, Australians, French, and others have contributed to the multinational mapping framework. The mapping has improved over time. Satellite imagery, beginning in the 1960s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s, has provided coverage that ground-based and aerial photography could not. Today, Antarctica is, in cartographic terms, one of the more thoroughly mapped continents on the planet. But the kind of detailed surface reconnaissance that Highjump represented has not been conducted on the same scale. The continent has been mapped from the air and from space. It has not been comprehensively surveyed at ground level by an integrated multi-vehicle operation comparable to what Highjump deployed. Whether there is, on the continent, something that ground-level reconnaissance would discover that aerial and satellite reconnaissance has not discovered, I cannot say. The treaty has had the practical effect of preventing such reconnaissance from being conducted at the scale necessary to answer that question. I want to address one specific subsequent operation, because it bears on the question of what the treaty does and does not allow. In 1957 to 1958, during the International Geophysical Year, a US-led trans-Antarctic crossing was conducted under the command of Sir Vivian Fuchs. The crossing went from the Weddell Sea side of the continent to the Ross Sea side, passing through the South Pole. It was the first overland traverse of the continent. The crossing was a scientific operation. It collected seismic and meteorological data along its route. It did not involve military reconnaissance. The crossing did not, however, conduct the kind of detailed photographic or geological survey that Highjump had conducted aerially. The traverse covered a specific overland route. It did not survey the broader continent. Subsequent overland operations have been similarly focused. They have been organised around specific scientific objectives, conducted by relatively small parties, and have not constituted comprehensive continental reconnaissance. The continent, in other words, has been studied scientifically, but has not been comprehensively explored in the way that Highjump was beginning to do. The treaty's restrictions have shaped the kind of access that has been permitted. I want to give you a breath. The pattern, in 78 years, is large operation, 1946 to 1947, then sustained restriction, then ongoing scientific access at limited scale. The continent has been preserved, but it has also been kept off limits to the kind of detailed exploration that Highjump represented. The preservation is good. The off-limits status is unusual. I want to walk through one more aspect of the story before closing. It is the question of what the alternative interpretations make of the silence. In the conspiratorial literature about Highjump, the silence in the archive is treated as evidence of suppression. The argument runs as follows. If Highjump had found something dramatic, a Nazi base, a non-human encounter, an anomalous geological feature, the US government would have wanted to keep that information secret. Therefore, the absence of information about dramatic findings is consistent with there having been dramatic findings that were suppressed. This argument is, in its logical structure, what philosophers call the argument from silence. The absence of information is taken as evidence for a particular interpretation of why the information is absent. Arguments from silence have a well-known weakness. The absence of information is, generally, consistent with multiple interpretations. The information could be absent because it was suppressed. The information could be absent because it never existed. The information could be absent because it was lost in routine record keeping. The information could be absent because it has not yet been declassified, but might be in the future. The argument from silence cannot, by itself, distinguish among these possibilities. What can distinguish among them, in some cases, is corroborating evidence. If a particular interpretation makes specific predictions that can be tested against other parts of the record, the corroboration or refutation of those predictions can strengthen or weaken the interpretation. In the Highjump case, the conspiratorial readings have not, in my view, produced corroborating evidence at the level required. The Chilean interview, in its preserved form, does not corroborate the dramatic readings. The unsigned classification guidance document, while interesting, is not authenticated. The various second-hand accounts that have emerged over the decades cannot be traced to verifiable primary sources. What I have offered, in my own analysis, is somewhat different. I have not argued for a specific dramatic interpretation. I've argued that the pattern of the operation, its scale, its truncation, its aftermath, is inadequately explained by the official explanations. This is a weaker claim than the conspiratorial readings make. It is also, I believe, a better supported claim. The pattern does not by itself establish that there was a specific dramatic finding. The pattern establishes that the official explanations are incomplete. The completion of the explanation, if it ever comes, may or may not include dramatic content. I want to give one more breath here. I've been talking in this story about restraint, about the difference between what the archive shows, what the archive does not show, and what we can legitimately infer from the gap. Restraint is not, in this context, a comfortable position. It is more comfortable to either accept the official explanation in full or to embrace the dramatic alternative reading. The official position lets us put the story away as a piece of conventional history. The dramatic alternative lets us put it away as a piece of revealed conspiracy. Restraint requires us to hold both possibilities in mind simultaneously. The official explanation is partly correct. The dramatic alternative may be partly correct. The full picture, if there is a full picture, is somewhere in the unmapped territory between the two. I have come, in my own work on this, to be comfortable with that uncomfortable position. The archive does not give clean answers. The archive gives patterns, gaps, indicators. Living with the patterns, gaps, and indicators, without rushing to resolve them in either direction, is what working with this kind of material requires. I do not know what Highjump found at Antarctica. I know what the official report says it found: mapping data, magnetic survey, logistical experience. I know what the alternative readings say it found. Variously, a Nazi base, non-human entities, suppressed geological evidence. The available evidence supports the official report in its general outline. The available evidence does not fully support the alternative readings in their more dramatic forms. The available evidence is, however, consistent with the operation, having included objectives that the public record does not fully describe. What those objectives might have been, the publicly accessible archive does not say. They might have been ordinary classified work, reconnaissance of Soviet activity, testing of military equipment in extreme conditions, demonstration of US capability in remote regions. They might also have included objectives that, if disclosed, would have changed our understanding of what the operation was actually about. I cannot, from the public archive, decide between these possibilities. Hold this. The Antarctic Treaty, signed 12 years after Highjump, declared an entire continent off-limits to ordinary national activity. The treaty has for more than 60 years held. The continent has been preserved, by international agreement, in a state that no other continent on Earth is preserved in. The preservation has done good things. The Antarctic environment is more intact than it would otherwise be. Scientific research has been able to proceed without the disruptions that competitive national activity would have caused. The continent has not become a venue for military conflict. These outcomes are real. They are valuable. The treaty has, by the standards of international agreements, been a successful instrument. What the treaty has also done, however, is to create a framework in which the kind of detailed exploration that Highjump represented can no longer be conducted. The continent is, under the treaty, accessible primarily to scientific research that operates within the treaty's restrictions. The military reconnaissance that Highjump conducted is not, under the treaty, permissible. If something exists on the continent that the treaty's restrictions effectively prevent from being thoroughly investigated, the treaty has had the effect of leaving that something undisturbed. I do not know whether anything exists on the continent that the treaty effectively prevents from being investigated. The public archive does not say. What I can say is that the treaty has, in practical effect, made the continent off-limits to the kind of investigation that might have determined the answer. I want to give you one more breath here. The story I have walked through tonight is about a pattern, not about a single dramatic event. The pattern is a large operation, an early termination, a sustained subsequent restriction. The pattern is consistent with several explanations. It is consistent with the official explanation that Highjump was training, that the truncation was logistical, that the treaty was diplomatic. It is consistent with a stronger reading, that Highjump encountered something, that the truncation was responsive to the encounter, that the treaty was the long-term institutional response. The available evidence does not, in my view, allow a clean choice between these explanations. The available evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. What the evidence does suggest is that the standard historiography, in its straightforward acceptance of the official narrative, has underestimated the strangeness of the pattern. The pattern is genuinely strange. The strangeness has been domesticated by the official explanations, in ways that are technically defensible, but that do not fully account for what actually happened. In 1947, the United States Navy sent 4,700 men, 13 ships and 33 aircraft to Antarctica. The operation was called Highjump. It was, officially, a training exercise. It returned to the United States in 7 weeks instead of the planned 6 to 8 months. It produced approximately 70,000 photographs, of which approximately 12,000 are now publicly accessible. It included a submarine whose specific missions remain partially undocumented in the public archive. Its commander, Richard E. Byrd, made statements upon his return that suggested the polar regions had strategic significance that the official report did not emphasize. A document in the operational records written in early 1947 recommended a pivot from military to diplomatic engagement with Antarctica. 12 years later, the Antarctic Treaty was signed. The treaty designated the continent as off-limits to military activity. The treaty has held for more than 60 years. The continent has not been the subject of subsequent military reconnaissance on the Highjump scale. The continent is, by any practical measure, off-limits. What the continent contains that motivated this multi-decade arrangement, the publicly accessible archive does not fully say. The records are at the National Archives at College Park. The personal papers are at the Byrd Polar and Climate Research Center at Ohio State University. The State Department negotiating files are partially declassified. The classified portions, if any remain, are wherever the US government keeps such materials. The pattern is what it is. The pattern is documented. The pattern is, in its specifics, strange enough to warrant continued attention. I want to walk through the question of they before closing. They in this story refers to a relatively specific group of decision makers. The Highjump termination was authorized by the Chief of Naval Operations with the approval of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The subsequent policy shift was driven by the US State Department in consultation with the Joint Chiefs and other agencies. The treaty negotiation was conducted by the State Department over the 1953 to 1959 period. The names of the relevant decision-makers are knowable. They are documented in the personnel records of the period. Their positions are in the government manual. Their decisions, where they were written down, are in the various agency archives. They buried what they buried, if they buried anything, through standard government processes. National security classification, need to know, compartmentalization. Routine retention practices that did not, by default, preserve every working document for public access. The treaty negotiation was, like most diplomatic negotiations, conducted partly in formal sessions and partly in informal conversations. The informal conversations are not, in general, preserved in the formal record. Whatever was communicated in informal conversation between US negotiators and their counterparts from other treaty parties is largely lost to the public archive. If there was a shared understanding among the negotiating parties about something specific that motivated the treaty's comprehensive restrictions, the understanding was communicated through channels, formal briefings between intelligence services, classified diplomatic exchanges, informal conversations between senior officials, that the public archive does not preserve. I cannot, from the public archive, reconstruct such a shared understanding. I can observe that the treaty, in its specific provisions, is consistent with the negotiating parties having had a shared concern about prohibited activity on the continent. The Article 7 inspection regime is the strongest evidence for this. Such regimes are constructed when the negotiating parties anticipate the need to verify compliance with restrictions that some party might be tempted to violate. What specific violation the inspection regime was anticipating, the public record does not say. I want to describe one specific moment from my research. I was working in the National Archives reading room on a Thursday afternoon in early April. The reading room was nearly empty. I had pulled box 47 of record group 313, which contained the post-operation correspondence from late February through April 1947. I was reading a routine memorandum about supply returns, the process by which equipment and supplies that had been issued to Task Force 68 were being returned to inventory after the operation ended. The memorandum was bureaucratic. The contents were tedious. I was about to set it aside, then I noticed something at the bottom of page 3. There was a list of equipment that was being marked as destroyed in field rather than returned to inventory. The list included several specific items: photographic equipment, 2 unspecified scientific instruments, and a quantity of film stock. Photographic equipment marked as destroyed in field in the routine post-operation supply return process. The notation was bureaucratic. The justification was given as operationally damaged beyond economical repair. This is, in military supply terminology, a standard category. Equipment that was damaged in the field is, in the normal course of business, written off rather than returned for repair. But the specific items, photographic equipment and film stock, were notable. Cameras in 1947 were expensive items. Film stock was, similarly, valuable. The destruction of these items in the field, rather than their return for inventory and possible repair, was not the default for an operation that had been substantially completed and was being demobilized. I made a note of the page and the specific items. I asked the archivist whether there was a more detailed record of what specific photographic equipment had been written off and what specific film stock. The archivist looked. The finding aid did not include a more detailed cross-reference. The detailed equipment records, if they existed, were either in classified holdings or had been lost in subsequent administrative reorganization. I do not know what the destroyed photographic equipment and film stock contained, if they contained anything. The destruction may have been routine, the damage may have been real, the equipment may have been genuinely beyond economical repair, but the notation sat in the file, in routine supply return language, indicating that specific photographic materials had been destroyed in the field rather than returned home. I want to be careful with this observation, as I've been careful with several others. The destruction of photographic equipment in the field is not by itself evidence of suppression of dramatic findings. Equipment is damaged in field operations. It is not always repairable. the decision to destroy unrecoverable equipment rather than transport it home is, in many cases, a routine logistical decision. What the notation establishes is that specific photographic materials existed at some point during the operation that were not returned home. Whether those materials contained anything significant, the supply return memorandum does not say. The memorandum simply notes the destruction. I include this observation in tonight's discussion because it is one of several small indicators that, taken together, suggest the photographic record of Highjump may be less complete than the publicly accessible archive indicates. I cannot, from this single supply notation, determine what photographic materials were destroyed or why. I can note that the destruction occurred and that it is documented, in routine bureaucratic language, in the surviving supply records. I have been sitting with this story for about 3 months. I came to it from a different research project on Navy post-war reorganisation, and I stayed with it because the more I read in the Highjump file, the more I found that the standard explanations did not fully account for what the operation actually was. I do not have a positive account of what Highjump found. I have observations about what the surviving record contains and what it does not contain. I have observations about how the pattern of activity, large operation, short duration, sustained subsequent restriction, fits or does not fit the official explanations. I think the pattern deserves more attention than it has received. I think the standard historiography has, in its understandable desire to avoid association with conspiracy literature, 4 closed lines of inquiry that the archive itself supports. The inquiry I would want to see is, in some ways, simple. It would involve a sustained academic engagement with the Highjump archive at the level of detail I have begun to describe. It would involve continued declassification of materials that have been classified for more than 70 years. It would involve the kind of integrated analysis that crosses the boundaries between military history, Antarctic policy, and the history of science. That kind of work has not, to my knowledge, been undertaken at the level of detail the question warrants. The work could be undertaken. The archives are accessible. The methods exist. Whether it will be undertaken is, like so many historical questions, a function of which questions the institutions and the disciplines decide to pursue. I want to describe one final piece of the archive. In Record Group 313, Box 49, Folder 11, there is a single sheet of paper. It is typed. It is unsigned. It is undated, though the typewriter ribbon characteristics and the paper weight are consistent with documents from the late 1940s or early 1950s. The document is one paragraph. It reads, Highjump findings to be retained in operational holdings, classification secret, distribution restricted to flag officers and above, on need-to-know basis, subsequent reference in unclassified publications to refer to training, mapping, and scientific objectives, full operational narrative not to be disclosed in unclassified channels. That is the entire document. The document is, on its face, a classification guidance memorandum. It instructs that the Highjump findings be retained in classified holdings, that distribution be restricted to senior officers, and that public references be limited to specific topics. The document is not signed, the document is not dated, the document is filed in the operational records of Highjump. I have asked the archivist on duty about the document. The archivist, after consulting the finding aid, told me that the document is not specifically catalogued and that its presence in the folder is somewhat unusual. The archivist could not tell me when or by whom it was placed there. I want to be careful with this document, in the same way I was careful with the unsigned memorandum I described in the Smithsonian story. The document is, on its face, the missing piece of explicit policy guidance. It articulates exactly the kind of restriction on disclosure that the broader Highjump pattern suggests must have existed. But the document is unsigned, undated, and uncatalogued. I cannot, from outside the security system, definitively authenticate it. It could be the genuine article, a working classification guidance memorandum that has survived in the operational files. It could also be something else, a draft, a copy, a forgery, a document placed in the folder at some point in the past 7 decades by someone who wanted future researchers to find it. I include it in this discussion because the evidentiary standard for this kind of story requires me to disclose what I have found, with the appropriate caveats about authentication. If the document is genuine, it is the explicit policy basis for the broader pattern of restricted disclosure I have been describing. If it is not genuine, then someone placed it in the folder. At some point, knowing what it would imply when found, I cannot determine which is the case. I want to spend a moment with the question of why this matters. A story from 1947 about an operation that was effectively closed 80 years ago, about a continent that has been protected by international treaty for more than 6 decades. Why dwell on it? I think there are 2 answers. The first is that the standard historiography, in absorbing the operation into ordinary post-war history, has constructed an account that is technically defensible, but that does not adequately match the operation's actual scale and aftermath. The mismatch is real. The pattern of activity, large operation, short duration, sustained restriction, sits in the record as documented but unexplained. The standard explanations function more as resolutions than as actual accounts. They close the question without addressing it. A story whose standard explanations close a question without addressing it is, I think, worth attention. Not because the conspiratorial alternatives are necessarily correct. Most of them, in their specifics, are not. But because the failure of the standard explanations is itself a piece of evidence about what kind of investigation needs to occur. The second answer is more general. The story of Highjump is one instance of a broader pattern. Governments conducting operations whose public face does not fully match their actual scope. Archives preserving documents whose interpretation requires more context than the documents themselves provide. International agreements producing outcomes whose justification is not fully articulated in the public record. That broader pattern is a feature of how modern states operate. The Highjump case is illustrative, not unique. Studying it carefully, with appropriate restraint, develops the analytical habits that allow us to evaluate similar cases in other contexts. I want to be clear about what I am not saying. I am not saying that governments routinely engage in dramatic conspiracies. I am saying that the gap between what governments do and what governments publicly explain about what they do is a normal feature of state activity, and that historical inquiry that takes the public explanations at face value often misses important aspects of what occurred. The Highjump story rewards careful inquiry of this kind. The careful inquiry does not produce a dramatic revelation. The careful inquiry produces a more textured understanding of what the operation was, what it was not, and what the gap between the two suggests about how the US government and its post-war partners approach the question of Antarctic activity. I want to walk through one more dimension of this story. It is the question of what we, in 2026, are entitled to know. Before that, however, I want to walk through one more dimension of the operational picture. The Highjump task force was structured into 3 distinct task groups, each with its own area of operations and its own component ships. The central group, designated Task Group 68.1, was built around the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea and the icebreakers Burton Island and Northwind. The central group's area of operations was the Ross Sea region, including the approaches to McMurdo Sound and the area east of the Ross Ice Shelf. The central group was the largest of the 3 task groups and conducted the bulk of the photographic mapping operations. The eastern group, designated Task Group 68.2, was built around the seaplane tender USS Pine Island and supporting vessels. The eastern group's area of operations was the Bellingshausen Sea and adjacent areas on the western side of the Antarctic Peninsula. The eastern group conducted aerial mapping of coastal regions that had not been adequately covered by previous expeditions. The western group, designated Task Group 68.3, was built around the seaplane tender USS Currituck. The western group operated in the area west of the Ross Sea, including Cape Adare and adjacent coastlines. The 3 task groups operated on coordinated but distinct schedules. They communicated with each other through standard naval channels, and with the operational headquarters through the command and communications ship USS Mount Olympus. The geographic distribution of the operation was, in itself, comprehensive. The 3 task groups, in their combined area of operations, covered substantial portions of the Antarctic coastline that had not previously been thoroughly surveyed. I want to note that the chosen areas, in their geographic distribution, included some that had been the focus of previous expeditions, and others that had not. The Ross Sea region had been visited by multiple previous Antarctic expeditions. The Bellingshausen Sea had been less thoroughly studied. The Western Group's area, around Cape Adare, had been the location of some of the earliest Antarctic exploration. The selection of areas was, presumably, made on the basis of operational considerations: accessibility, weather patterns, the value of additional reconnaissance relative to prior coverage. The selection criteria in the publicly accessible planning documents are described in general terms. The specific reasoning for each area selection is not, in the planning documents I have reviewed, laid out in detail. Now, the question of what we are entitled to know. Operation Highjump was conducted 78 years ago. The decision-makers who authorised it are all dead. The personnel who participated in it are nearly all dead. A small handful of very elderly survivors may still be alive, but they are not in positions of any official capacity. The strategic environment in which the operation was authorised, the immediate post-war period, the emerging Cold War, the uncertainty about Soviet intentions, the unresolved status of various post-war issues, has been superseded by subsequent history many times over. The standard rationale for continued classification of materials is that disclosure would harm current national security. The standard rationale rarely applies to materials more than 50 years old. Most US classified materials are subject to automatic declassification after 25 years, with extensions possible, but requiring specific justification. Most high-jump materials should, by ordinary US classification procedures, be declassified by now. Most of them are. The publicly accessible archive I have been describing is the product of declassification processes that occurred between 1947 and the present. What remains classified, if anything, is presumably classified under specific exemptions to the standard declassification timeline. The exemptions are real but limited. They apply to materials whose disclosure would, in the current judgment of relevant officials, harm specific, identifiable interests. If any high-jump materials remain classified, those materials presumably contain information whose disclosure would still, in 2026, harm current interests. What current interests could be harmed by disclosure of 1,947 Antarctic operational records? The straightforward answer is technical military methods that remain in use. If the Senate's classified missions involve testing of sonar techniques or submarine operating procedures that are still relevant to current submarine operations, the technical details could remain classified to protect current operational security. This is, by US classification standards, a legitimate basis for continued classification of 78-year-old materials. A less straightforward answer is discoveries that, if disclosed, would change the strategic landscape in ways that current officials judge should not be changed. If Highjump found something on Antarctica, that disclosure would change. That would, for example, motivate other nations to seek to investigate that something in violation of the treaty, or that would change public attitudes toward Antarctic policy in ways that current officials prefer not to invite. The classification could persist on those grounds. This second basis is more speculative. It is also harder to verify from outside. The classification system does not typically state its specific rationales in publicly accessible form. Material remains classified, or is declassified, on the basis of decisions made by officials whose reasoning is internal to the system. I cannot, from outside the system, distinguish between these two bases for continued classification if continued classification exists. I want to address one more dimension before I bring this to its close. Throughout this discussion, I have referred to the archive as if it were a single thing. The archive is, of course, several things. The archive includes the publicly accessible high-jump operational records at the National Archives. The archive includes the Byrd personal papers at Ohio State University. The archive includes the State Department negotiating files for the Antarctic Treaty. The archive includes the public after-action reports, the published photographs, the journalistic and academic literature that has analysed the operation over the decades. The archive also includes, in some form, whatever classified holdings exist in the operational holdings of the Navy, the State Department, the intelligence community, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These holdings, where they exist, are not accessible to outside researchers. They may be substantial, they may be minimal, they may have been destroyed in routine records management over the decades. I cannot tell. What I can tell is that the publicly accessible archive is incomplete relative to what the operation is documented to have produced. The photographic gap I described earlier is one indicator. The unsigned classification guidance document I described is another. The full debriefing upon return reference in Byrd's February 14 message is a third. These indicators are consistent with the existence of substantial classified holdings. They are also consistent with ordinary administrative loss of materials over 78 years. The honest assessment from outside the system is that the public archive is incomplete and that we cannot, from outside, fully account for the incompleteness. I want to give you a breath here. We have walked through a great deal of material tonight. Highjump's operational scale, its truncation, the Cruisen and Byrd communications, the Senate, the photographic gap, the Antarctic Treaty, the IGY, the post-treaty restriction of activity, the unsigned classification guidance document, the question of continued classification. The pattern is documented. The pattern is unusual. The reasons for the pattern, in their specifics, are not in the publicly accessible record. You do not need to hold every name. You do not need to track every detail. The records are at College Park. The personal papers are at Ohio State. The treaty text is public. The State Department files are partially accessible. The pieces of the story are there for anyone who chooses to assemble them. I want to walk through what an investigation, if it were undertaken, might find. The investigation I would want to see would be a sustained academic project, conducted by a team with access to relevant archives across multiple agencies. The team would include military historians, archive specialists, and possibly representatives from the relevant federal agencies who could facilitate access to materials still in operational holdings. The investigation would seek to do several things. First, complete the photographic archive. Identify all the Highjump photographs that the expedition is documented to have produced. Locate them in whatever holdings they currently reside in, and make them available to researchers under appropriate access protocols. Some of these photographs may be in classified holdings. Some may be in unclassified holdings that have not been properly catalogued. Some may have been lost. Second, declassify the operational records that remain classified, where current security considerations no longer justify continued classification. 78 years is a long time. The vast majority of materials from that era have been declassified. What remains should be reviewed for whether continued classification is justified. Third, conduct a systematic analysis of the Highjump command and control communications, the radio messages between the task force and Navy headquarters, the cables that were sent during the operation, the briefings that occurred upon return. Where these materials exist, in classified or declassified form, they should be made available to researchers. Fourth, integrate the Highjump archive with the Antarctic Treaty negotiating record. The question of whether Highjump findings influence the treaty negotiations is a researchable question, given access to the relevant materials. The integrated analysis has not, to my knowledge, been conducted at the level of detail the question warrants. Fifth, conduct a comparative analysis with other contemporaneous operations. Were there other large post-war US military operations that exhibited similar patterns? Large scale, short duration, restricted disclosure. The comparative analysis would help establish whether Highjump's pattern was unique or whether it was characteristic of a broader category of operations. This investigation has not, to my knowledge, been undertaken. It could be undertaken. The materials, where they are accessible, the methods exist. The funding would need to be substantial, but is not by the standards of major historical research projects prohibitive. Whether such an investigation will be undertaken depends, as so often, on which questions the institutions and the disciplines decide to pursue. I want to acknowledge something about the limits of my own work on this. I am one researcher. I have spent 5 weeks at the National Archives, additional time with the digital materials at Ohio State and the State Department's online holdings, and time reading the published literature. My research has been limited by what I can access, what I can read in the time available, and what I have funding to pursue. A more thorough investigation, by a properly resourced team with access to materials that I cannot access, would presumably find things I have not found. It might also find that the things I have noted have explanations I have not been able to construct from the available evidence. I want to be clear that what I am offering tonight is an informed researcher's view, based on what I have been able to access. It is not the final word. It is not the only possible reading. What it is, I hope, is an honest attempt to describe what the public archive contains, what it does not contain, and what the patterns visible in the public archive support and do not support. I want to describe what the reading room at College Park is like. The reading room sits on the second floor of the main archives building, in the textual research section. It is a large room and perhaps 80 feet by 60 feet, with 2 rows of long oak tables, each table seating 8 researchers. The tables are lit by overhead fluorescent fixtures, supplemented by individual reading lamps mounted at each station. The reading room contains, on any given weekday, somewhere between 30 and 60 researchers. The researchers are a mix of academics, genealogists, military historians, journalists, and amateur enthusiasts. They are mostly older. The average age in the reading room on the days I was there appeared to be in the late 50s or early 60s. They are mostly white, they are mostly American. The staff is small. 3 reference archivists are typically on duty. They are knowledgeable, patient, and helpful. They answer questions, retrieve boxes from the closed stacks, and assist with the finding aids. The research process is methodical. You arrive in the morning. You sign in at the reception desk. You present your researcher card. You proceed to the reading room. You consult the finding aids, which are large bound volumes that list the contents of the various record groups. You request specific boxes by writing the record group number, the box number, and your seat number on a small slip of paper. You submit the slip to the staff. The boxes come up from the closed stacks on rolling carts. The delivery typically takes between 30 minutes and 90 minutes, depending on the depth of the request and the workload of the day. The boxes are delivered to your seat. You work through them with cotton gloves where the materials require them, taking notes by hand or by laptop. At the end of the day, you return the boxes to the staff. The boxes go back to the closed stacks. You return your researcher card. You leave. This is in essence what I did for 5 weeks this spring. I want to describe what it felt like. It felt slow. It felt deliberate. It felt like a kind of work that the modern information environment is not designed to support. You could not Google the answers. You could not search the documents electronically. You could read what was in the boxes in the order in which it appeared, at the pace your eyes could move through the pages. This is, in some sense, the slow work that the archive requires. The fast work, the Google search, the database query, the keyword extraction, has its place. The slow work is what produces the kind of textured understanding that this material requires. The slow work is what allows you to notice the unsigned memorandum filed loose in folder 7. The slow work is what lets you see the pattern of the missing photographs. The slow work is what surfaces the supply notation about destroyed equipment. The slow work is also what most modern research environments are not structured to reward. Academic incentive structures favour faster, more measurable, more easily publishable work. The kind of patient sitting with the boxes that this material requires is, in many academic contexts, undervalued. I am aware that I am, in saying this, describing my own work in flattering terms. I want to acknowledge that. The slow work is also slow because the researcher is sometimes not skilled enough to be faster, or because the researcher has the privilege of time that other researchers do not have. The slow work is not virtuous in and of itself. The slow work is appropriate to particular kinds of material, of which the Highjump archive is one. The records of Operation Highjump are still at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. They occupy several linear feet of shelf space in record group 313. They are accessible to any researcher with a federal-issued researcher card. They have been there in various federal facilities since the operation ended in 1947. The records describe a training operation that was, on its face, the largest Antarctic deployment in history. The records describe a truncation whose causes are addressed but not, in my reading, fully explained. The records describe photographic and operational gaps that are documented, but not, in the publicly accessible archive, filled. The records do not say what specifically the operation found that motivated its truncation, the subsequent policy shift, the eventual treaty. The records are silent on the specific cause. The records are not silent on the pattern. The pattern, in 78 years, has not been adequately explained by anything in the public archive. I want to close with one final observation. The Antarctic continent, in physical terms, is approximately 5.5 million square miles. It is the 5th largest continent on Earth. It contains approximately 70% of the world's fresh water, locked in ice sheets that are, in places, more than 2 miles thick. What lies beneath the ice has been mapped in recent decades through radar surveys. The continent has substantial mountain ranges hidden beneath the ice. It has subglacial lakes, Lake Vostok being the largest and best known. It has river systems carved into the rock beneath the ice, fed by geothermal heat and pressure melting at the base of the ice sheets. It has, in some areas, subglacial bedrock topography that is dramatically lower than sea level. The Bentley Subglacial Trench, for example, reaches more than 2,000 meters below sea level. The subglacial Antarctic is, in geological terms, a substantial and partially unexplored environment. The radar surveys have mapped the broad outlines. They have not in general conducted detailed examination of subglacial features at the level that would identify smaller anomalies. What might exist beneath the Antarctic ice, in the unexplored interior of the continent, is a real question. The standard scientific answer is rock, ice, water, and the geological features that one would expect from a continent that has been ice-covered for tens of millions of years. The standard scientific answer may be correct. It may also be incomplete. The continent is large. The mapping is, at the level of detailed local examination, partial. What I can say is that the treaty's restrictions, by limiting access to the kind of detailed exploration that Highjump represented, have left the question of what specifically exists in the unexplored interior less resolved than it might otherwise be. I have walked the perimeter of this story for tonight. I have laid out what the public records contain. I have noted what they do not contain. I have described the patterns that, in my view, the standard historiography has not fully addressed. What remains in any complete account is the actual content of the classified materials, if classified materials exist. That content, by definition, is not available to me. It is not available to any researcher outside the security system. The honest position is to acknowledge what I have access to and what I do not have access to. The honest position is to describe the patterns visible in the public record without overclaiming about what the patterns mean. The honest position is to flag the questions that the public record raises without insisting on specific answers that the public record does not support. That is what I have tried to do. The continent waits. It has been waiting since 1959 in the configuration that the treaty established. It will continue to wait under the treaty's provisions until at least 2048, when the Madrid Protocol's mining ban is scheduled for review. What the continent contains, what Highjump found there, what motivated the multinational decision to declare it off limits, these are questions that the publicly accessible archive does not fully answer. The questions are documented. The answers where they exist are not in the public archive. Thank you for staying with me through this story.